World of Magic TG. It was nearing the end of an ordinary fall day. The leaves had not fallen from the trees yet, but the wind was blowing terribly cold. It felt like it was about to snow and a cold winter was coming. Sergei walked along the narrow path through the city park to his home in a hurry, jumping over small puddles, because there he waited for his wife, a warm dinner and, of course, his favorite couch, on which he spent his evenings. Military service, of course, was exhausting, then chase the youth to nowhere called up, then walk from the barracks to the dining room and back. In general, you can overwork. Near the entrance he stumbled and collapsed with his face on the doorjamb, feeling a burning sensation on his face. Swearing, he got up, shook himself off, and headed for his apartment. On the threshold of which, his wife Yulia was already waiting for him. Her eyes glistened strangely, and in her right hand she was clutching a rolling pin for some reason. I wonder if she will beat or not, thought to himself, and scratched the place where he usually sits. What are you, again drunk? Yulia said threateningly and struck a blow on the back of Sergei, running away from all feet. Wait, you'll come back, I'll add you for the late return. Wagging her finger, Yuliana went into the apartment. I got it for nothing. I drank 100 grams for a co-worker's birthday. Told me that girls change dramatically after marriage, and I did not realize how much, said Sergei and left the entrance. As luck would have it was freezing rain. Sergei cold fingers took a cigarette out of the pack and began to light, at this time heard shouting and fussing around the corner of the house. Coming to the noise saw 3 tall guys in jean jackets, kicking big leather boots. Old man, who was just lying on the ground and covered his head with his hands, did not even make attempts to fight back. What are you, completely crazy, throwing at old people, or do not have anyone to fight with? Sergei said loudly and rolled up his sleeves and headed towards the youth. One of the guys raised his head and saw that in their direction is a man in military uniform with a terrible grin and numerous bruises on his face. Said, "Guys, let's go." After these words, as if by magic, the guys were gone, and only the old man, who had apparently been beaten up pretty good, was left lying on the ground. He was lying motionless in a cold puddle. Coming closer, Sergei noticed that on the dried-up face from old age there were only minor abrasions. As if he had not been beaten at all, but stroked. The old man himself stood up, shook himself off, looked around and stared at Sergei and said, "Thank you, good fellow, you stepped in, did not leave the old man in trouble." Something was not so in the old man. Sergei looked at his broad chest, long wiry arms. In him felt the former power. "I see you are not verbose, it's good, but you need to close your mouth, and then the flies fly in," continued the old man, while stroking his grey beard. "I mean why I came. I really need the help of such a rich man as you." "What's the problem, father?" Remembering his wife, who was probably waiting for him now with a rolling pin in her hands, Sergei added, "I'll help in any way I can. If Russ was with me, I could go to hell without fear." After a little thinking, he said to himself, "Although better with an awesome girl, the company would be nicer." The old man frowned, narrowed his eyes, looked more like a representative of the Korean Republic, and said something. The words, or rather some adverb, seemed strange and incomprehensible to Sergei. Suddenly his eyes went dark, his body became cotton, he could only fall asleep. I woke up to a terrible rumbling, swearing, and for some reason in the mud. When he stood up, he looked around and saw a black forest. Huge ginnermouse tree trunks surrounded the clearing where he stood with a huge wall. Apparently, here has never set foot man, thought to himself, but seeing in the bushes flickering absolutely naked female figure, said, "Wow, and I like it here," has already started to approach to consider the female charms, heard. "Here you feathery, now I will give in the forehead, bald," said the stranger, covering her charms with burdocks. Her long black Astar hair fell on her shoulders, smooth silky skin beckoned to her, her figure was delightful. And blue bottomless eyes looked at him. One flaw Sergei saw in her appearance, it is pointed to the top of the ears. "Sorry for scaring, it's just a joke, I will not touch you." Becoming a little closer to approach with some apprehension said, "My name is Sergei, and you is your name? Listen to me, victim of crossbreeding, that you do not recognize, hey? So what if your dignity fell off on the way, so you have to look?" Sergei was stunned by what he heard, he didn't know what to say, instead of words he was mumbling. "Russ you?" he said in a pitiful voice and ran to his best friend whom he missed so much, began to embrace. "Listen, I'm not one of these, but of a different color, what are you after?" Ruslana pushed Sergei in the chest, he flew back a few meters and hit the ground. "Wow, that's the power," looking at her seemingly ordinary female hands said Ruslana, and completely forgetting about the nakedness approached Sergei. "Gray, do you know where we are?" "No, and you?" "Well, and I do not." Standing up on his feet, Sergei rubbed his belly said, "I wonder if this forest will give us something to eat." "Yeah, and looking around Ruslana added, "only if any other perverts were not, and that I walk around naked, you will have something to show, and I do not have it at all." Not thinking long, Sergei mumbled, "And how did you get here?" "No way, came after work, ate, sat down in the toilet. Btz it became dark, I thought my eyes burst from exertion. And here I found myself in a woman's skin," he said, looking contemptuously at Sergei, at least lucky not to be so offended. Thinking, Sergei cautiously approached the puddle, looking into it shouted, "Holy crap, is that me?" Turning his head and waving his hands, Sergei looked at the puddle, in the reflection of which stood a man with his face, in place of hair feathers, they also spread throughout the body, below the knees was a real, as Sergei thought, chicken skin. Instead of fingernails, long, rounded inward claws. "Let's stop admiring, let's go somewhere, or it'll be dark soon," said Ruslana, heading in the direction she had chosen by scientific poke, in short, in the first direction she could find. Sergei did not want to interfere, because he knew him, and to be more precise, he could not change her mind. And if Ruslan got something into his head, it would be impossible to get it out with a stake. So it would be easier to obey. When it was completely dark, a mist floated between the trees. It seemed to Sergei to be alive and deliberately hid the scary inhabitants of the forests, who were ready to eat them alive. Ruslana was proudly making her way through the forest, looking around. She heard quiet voices everywhere, as if the trees were talking to each other, and she shook her head and went on her way. "All right, you can't go far at night anyway, you'll only poke your eyes out," Ruslana added. "Good night." Ruslana quivered like an old grandmother and lay down on the bed she had prepared in a couple of minutes, and immediately a snore came from her side. Sergei did not prepare a similar bed, but lay down on the damp ground, having previously put a thick driftwood log under his head. In the stomach constantly rumbled, reminding the owner that the stomach is empty. It was still terribly cold, and in addition around everything squelching, moving, cracking branches. It was only in the morning that Sergei was able to fall asleep. Suddenly he felt a blow to his liver and woke up, and saw Ruslana in front of him, who was pointing behind him with her index finger to her lips. He turned around, suddenly he felt wild, the feathers on his head stirred. Not far from their lodge, in the middle of a clearing, two stumps were fighting, covered not with bark, but with something resembling scales of green-brown color. They were screaming terribly, hitting each other with hands more like crooked branches, scratching. "Sergei, look, food," said Ruslana. "I'm not going to eat them," said Sergei. "No, it's a bough," as a mouse squeaked Ruslana and crawled to the bough made of thick, large leaves of unseen grass and birch bark. She stopped, looked around, and making sure that she was not being watched, grabbed it and crawled toward Sergei. At that moment he imagined what would happen to them if those two, as he remembered from his grandmother's fairy tales, would notice them. But who cares how to die, although fed, of course, better, decided Sergei and smiled at the foresters, who did not even notice the loss of the bowls. Having run away to a far distance, Ruslana stopped and put the bough on the ground and began to savor forest berries. Sergei also did not lag behind and needed handfuls. Already satiated, they ate by picking, and at the bottom there was only sour and not very tasty in their opinion berries. Ruslana stood up, wiped her wet hands on the grass that hung from the loincloth she had made, and headed for the nearest bushes. Apparently she wanted to go to the toilet, Sergei thought, and lay down on the fluffy grass beside the bowls and dreamily threw his head up to the sky. At that moment some huge, more like an eagle bird flew across the sky, but all as if made of gold, feathers glistened and shimmered in the sun. "I wish. Gray, come here," came Ruslana's voice, which as always interrupted, spoiled his reflections on the higher. Sergei slowly and not though stood up, groaned. At that very moment he looked like an old man bird who was about to throw off his paws. But with apparent reluctance he headed for the voice. As he walked through the weeds, he noticed that his feathers were gradually falling off, as were the scales on his legs, and instead of them appeared the usual human and familiar skin. "What else?" growled Sergei, making his way through the thicket. And having passed this terrible and unpleasant obstacle between him and Ruslana, Sergei shrieked. "Wow!" with amazement exclaimed Sergei, looking at the endless at first glance glade and taking a breath full of chest, said. "What a beauty!" He stood and looked and could not admire the green, covered with clover as a blanket field. Around flew insanely beautiful butterflies, shimmering from bright red to silver color. Not high above the ground, unseen birds, more like hummingbirds, were flying and chirping. It seemed to Sergei that they were in a real paradise. Ruslana stared at Sergei, who seemed mesmerized by the wonders of nature. Ruslana pointed to a lone tree in the center of the field. From here it looked more like a small bush with a thick trunk. But as she approached, the bush grew larger and larger, and finally it became a huge oak with large, gigantic branches coming from an incredibly thick trunk. "I wish I had one of those for firewood," Ruslana said. It took her more than one attempt to climb the first branch of the huge oak. But already at the top she shouted. "Come here, the view is better here," shouted Ruslana. Climbing the branches like our distant ancestor monkey, she tried to tear off some badly screwed branch. From her help, so to speak, at the moment when Sergei was climbing the trunk of the tree, acorns about the size of a coconut were flying from above. When Ruslana and Sergei heard the creaking and cracking in the tree, they lurked like mice smelling a cat. Ruslana looked down and saw a hole in the trunk of the tree, from which an old man in a white robe and a cap like a stargazer came out. Behind him a girl with green hair. Her body was really feminine, her short dress covered her thighs, but her face was like a little girl's. As they entered the field, the old man began to say some elaborate words and stared at the sky. The girl kept tugging his sleeve and asking him when we would be there, but the old man waved her off and told her to wait. Suddenly, sitting on the very top of the tree, Sergei noticed a huge bird with golden feathers approaching them, which he had previously observed in the clearing in the forest. Landing near the old man in a strange garb, the bird put one wing on the ground, letting the old man and the girl climb up on its thick neck. And with a few smooth flaps of her wings, she pushed off the ground and flew away, carrying the strange couple away. "Enough admiring, they haven't closed the house," said Ruslana, climbing down from the tree. "You wouldn't think he was a policeman," said Sergei at half strength, slowly climbing down. Once on the ground, Ruslana tiptoed cautiously inside the dwelling. Fearing that the old man hadn't taken everyone, Ruslana looked around to avoid getting into an awkward situation. "Then you'll have to prove that you're at peace when they hit you with something heavy, well, if they don't kill you." When she was sure the house was empty, Ruslana relaxed and rummaged through the first trunk she could find. She looked in the far corner of the house. On the bench there was a dress of the same shape as that girl's, only dark green in color, and boots with high shins were lying on the floor next to it. She walked around the huge hall, in the middle of which stood a rectangular table, apparently made of a material more like granite. And on the very edge of the table was a thick leather-bound book with leaves yellowed with antiquity. Ruslana sat down at the table and began to leaf through the book, looking at the pictures and not going into the details of the intricate sentences. Suddenly there was a rumble and clang of metal, and she ran toward the exit. There on the floor Sergei was lying sprawled out. Next to him a large wooden cabinet had been broken. The room was scattered with all sorts of strange objects and a large number of medieval weapons. Standing up on his feet, he picked up a large sword, sharpened on both sides. Holding it in his hands, a cold spark ran across the sword. "Russ, look what I found, it looks like silver." Demonstratively waving the sword added, "Well? Normal, I see that you also found clothes to fit," Ruslana said, digging into the pile of weapons. And having found what she was looking for, smirked and pulled out a sword also sharpened on both sides from the same metal, but in place of the usual stop was a plate of oval shape. "And you look, as all the same from Chinese action movies." Began to twist in front of himself and hit the fictional villains. Ruslana. Sergei stood in front of the mirror and still looked at the leather boots, similar, however, to military kurzovye, wide pants and a thick vest. "Enough admiring, we must go," Ruslana said and headed for the exit. Leaving the dwelling she took with her a wooden bow and quiver with arrows that hung at the entrance, and Sergei already carried in his hands that incomprehensible book, while on the way began to read to himself. At the moment when they came out and were back in the field, there was a creaking and cracking sound behind them, but they did not turn around, because they knew that the door to the house closed miraculously as it had opened. "So, Gray, where shall we go?" Ruslana broke the silence, scratching the back of her head through a strand of thick hair. Now. Come on, hurry up," Ruslana said angrily. "Here, listen. It turns out in this world are all the fairy tale creatures that once inhabited our land." Not taking a break from reading the book continued, "A long time ago, they left the earth through a portal, because they refused the path of progress and kept all their magic. It is also written that recently, unknown from where, some evil came and began to exterminate fairy creatures and populate this land with evil creatures, i.e. monsters. You better tell me, what unreasonable person threw us here, and even mocked us? He turned me into a woman, I can't go to the bathroom like a human." Ruth didn't notice how Sergei's face turned red. Of course he guessed and didn't really want to tell about the old man he saved from the hooligans. "Listen, let's go to that mountain, because according to the book there lives a great sorcerer, who in ancient times and moved all the fairy creatures in this world," said Sergei and fell silent. Ruslana was already standing with a drawn bow and aimed at the sky. After releasing the arrow, she took off from her seat and ran in the same direction where the arrow flew. A few dozen meters away, she stopped, bent down, and started digging in the grass. She picked up a duck and shouted, "That's dinner!" Sergei broke away from his seat, ran up to Ruslana and snatched the bird from her, took out a knife, taken from his words on rent in the hut of the stargazer, began to cut it up. "Wait, how are we going to roast it?" Sergei said regretfully, "I don't really want to eat it raw." "You peel, and I'll think of something," said Ruslana, and in an instant disappeared into the nearest bushes. A few minutes later she came back with a bundle of brushwood. She took 2 stones out of her bag and began to beat them against each other. Sparks appeared, the dry grass suddenly burst into orange flames and then went out. "The wind is disturbing, we must find a quieter place," said Sergei, headed for the bushes. Right behind them were rare tall trees on the trunks of which hung Tina. Literally at once the swamp began. The smell of rottenness and dampness hit the nose. But there was no wind at all. Ruslana quickly built and lit a fire. Sergei threaded a duck carcass on a thick branch and put it on the pre-prepared slings and waited for the preparation of the first normal dinner for these days. "That's enough. Done, you can start taking off the spit duck," said Sergei. Tearing it, he gave one part to Ruslana, and the second part he greedily bit into with his teeth. Biting into it he stopped, some moisture running down his chin. He said, "Wow, it's so fatty," he said, praising the dinner he had prepared. When all that was left of the duck were bones, Sergei patted his stomach and then wiped his chin. There was fresh blood on his hand. Realizing that he hadn't cooked the duck, he kept silent. Ruslana's bones were also lying around. And seeing his gaze, she asked, "Is something wrong?" "Not everything is normal, good night," said Sergei, turning away from the fire, so that the heat warmed his back. Ruslana did not prepare a bed this time, it was very hard to move. So she lay down near the fire on the damp ground, curled up like a baby. "Ah, you slimy bastard," Sergei heard through his sleep. He was being pulled somewhere by his leg. He felt his face covered with bitter and disgusting water and mud. He pushed with his free foot the one who was dragging him so fiercely. He rose sharply and swung his fist into the darkness. When he felt his fist hit something soft and slimy, he heard a squeal. He recoiled, and at the same moment several pairs of bony and nasty paws reached for him. Sergei began to fight them off. They scratched him and tried to tear him into several pieces. Behind him Ruslana was beating indiscriminately with her bare fists. Suddenly the clearing was illuminated by a cold silver flame. Sergei turned around and saw Ruslana holding a sword, which she used to mercilessly chop those ugly humanoid, frog-headed creatures. After each blow, the abomination flared up and burned in a blue flame. As he fell on his back from the onslaught of the undead, he felt the hilt of his sword under his hand. With a few swings of his sword, the clearing lit up with blue flames, his eyes bloodshot, and he continued to slash. The undead were still coming from the depths of the swamp, their strength was almost gone. The clearing where they stood was covered in ash up to his ankles. It clogged their nostrils and made it hard to breathe. Ruslana felt with every swing of her sword that she was about to be torn apart by these creatures. From time to time a picture appeared in front of her eyes as she was being sliced into pieces. The creatures were saying, "Good prey, soft, juicy." Suddenly the horizon became brighter. The first ray of sunlight fell on one of these frogs, which people call ghouls. This toad-like creature squealed and ran into the thicket of the forest, its body covered with blisters, and then it caught fire. Not having run a few steps to the saving swamp, it collapsed on the ground. Ruslana's bloody lips burst out and turned towards Sergei, who was sitting on a bump, with his hands hanging down from powerlessness, and added, "We must leave." "What are you saying?" Further they decided to move along the steppe, trying not to go into the forest. And only occasionally ran into the thicket of the forest to gather wood for the fire. Several days passed before they saw the first human settlement. As they passed a huge, half-rotten double-leaf gate, Ruslana began to look at the strange low-slung log houses with thatched roofs. Instead of windows, the tiny houses had roughly cut holes and were covered with some kind of translucent film. The old women looked at the travelers with a certain apprehension in their eyes, spat at the passing couple, and said something. "I'm sure they don't like my clothes," Ruslana said, fixing her dress and raising her head proudly. "No, apparently they don't like you themselves." Seeing a tavern ahead, Sergei added a step and in the next minute was already wiping his feet on a straw mat at the threshold of the place. He sat down at the first table he found and said, "I wonder what they're staring at. Probably they are thinking how much they will charge for such a sucker." Ruslana, having raised her head with a brazen look and with obvious disdain, began to examine the visitors of the tavern. At the tables sat only women, young and old, in strange long dresses decorated with bright lace patterns. They paid no attention to her, but were all looking at Sergei, who, at that moment, was throwing up his thick, wiry arms and stretching. Suddenly, as if out of thin air, a young girl appeared at their table. Her light straw hair was braided into a thick braid, her face slightly overweight, her nose proudly turned up to look at Sergei. "Do you want something?" she said without breaking her gaze. "Yes, give me something tasty, and it's been a long time since I ate anything," pointing at his stomach said Sergei. "Now I'll bring," she threw, slowly walking towards the kitchen, like a model on the runway. The next moment on the table were several wooden plates with porridge. In the middle of the table was a freshly roasted goose. The smell of meat made her head spin, and ignoring the suspicious stares, Ruslana began to hastily knead the food, disregarding the rules of etiquette. When she was satiated and rubbing her full belly, she began to admire how three young girls, one prettier than the other, were snooping around Sergei, feeding him from a spoon and trying to accidentally catch him with their elastic body parts. Sergei, shimmering with different colors and burning with shame, continued to swallow his food. Ruslana stood up from the table and went out onto the wooden porch of the tavern, not wanting to disturb the young girls who had already surrounded Sergei and without a shadow of shyness offered to spend the night. An old woman passed by on the street, and after examining Ruslana from head to toe, she said, "You're not from around here, you're showing your shame," said the old fat woman, pressing her cane into the ground. Ruslana looked at her half-naked thighs and said with a very brazen look, "And what is it? We all dress like that, no one complains," looking contemptuously at the old woman added, "Probably herself in her youth and not like that seduced men." The old woman took air in her mouth, spit on the ground and whispered a little audibly, "Don't be a fool, or the troll will take you away and you'll give birth to children." The old woman crossed Ruslana and left. Ruslana thought to herself, "She's a strange woman, and trolls have nothing to do with it." Almost to the night she wandered around the village, talking to the grandmothers, listening to stories. There was a fortress near the mountains where men were kept as slaves and young girls were kept for the trolls. According to the stories they looked too ugly, huge giants, with a big head and in the mouth huge fangs. They could tear a man in two with little fingers. When the sun had set and it was dark, Ruslana went into a nearby stable to sleep for the night and not to disturb the locals. Once inside, she was also convinced that these huge trolls were also taking the horses. "They must need a lot of meat for these giants," I thought to myself and lay down on the fresh hay and fell asleep. "Ruth, Ruth, wake up," she heard before someone poked her in the side. "What else?" Ruslana said, waving her hand away. When she opened her eyes, she saw a frightened Sergei squatting on the ground and saying quietly so that no one would hear the words, "Russ, it's time to run away, they tortured me all night, all night." He often turned back, expecting apparently a crowd of girls who missed male affection, who would now rush in and tear his one and only. Suddenly the gate closed prematurely by Sergei knocked. From the courtyard came women's squeals, words of love and requests to stay. "They won't let me sleep," said Ruslana, and, coming to the gate, opened it. A good crowd of women, both young and older, were already standing in the courtyard. Ruslana, seeing one of them, imagined how much vodka she would have to drink to make her beautiful, wrinkled her nose and said, "Babes, we know how hard it is for you," so he, pointing at Sergei, looking out from behind the gate of the stable, "will go to these trolls, give them on their hairy ass, and return the husbands to the stall." There was silence. The women murmured among themselves, looked at Sergei. In their minds he was a hero, or maybe a fool. Someone even fainted. Sergei and Ruslana took advantage of this, heroically with their heads held high, headed north. The women followed them silently, seeing them off to their last journey, all the way to the gate. In the distance I could see rocks showing their sharpened teeth to the sky, and the ground was getting harder. The wonderful birds flying overhead had disappeared, and fear was creeping closer to her heart. Ruslana imagined that some huge troll would tear them to pieces and eat them with bones without choking on them. Suddenly a monkey-like creature jumped out of the bushes with a wild roar, covered with black hair. Its head resembled a human's, but its nose was flattened and its ears were flattened. It was not tall enough, though, just about Ruslana's chest. The creature looked at her with its narrow eyes and said, "Who are you that walk on the land of the mighty and terrible Varlo, king of the trolls?" The creature was holding a medium-long spear with a sharpened tip, which it was pointing at Ruslana and Sergei. Apparently it could not decide which of them it would pierce first. When the tip of the spear stopped on Sergei, he grabbed the shaft of the spear with one hand, pulling it toward him, and with the fist of his other hand he struck the top of the troll's head. At that moment there was a crunch of broken bones of the skull, and the troll collapsed to the ground. At the same moment, drops of dark blood appeared on the grass, which was instantly absorbed into the ground. Ruslana turned to Sergei and twirled the index finger of her right hand at his temple. "Do you even realize what you're doing? He may not be alone. And what do you think they'll do to us when they find this one with a broken head? They won't do anything. What if they come in droves?" Sergei, rubbing his fists, looked at the rocks, which had already become bigger and more terrible. "We'll give them horns, and then we'll see if anyone will be spared. But no, we'll kill them all." As Ruslana looked at the place where the troll had jumped out, she shouted, "Look at that," she said, pointing her finger at the trench dug in the ground, adding, "It looks like a sentry, but how he was supposed to report our arrival is unclear." Not finding an answer to this question, the heroes continued on their way. From time to time they stopped for a night's rest, and the bag of provisions became lighter. The water ran out and as a pity there was not a single brook nearby. For the second night they went to bed hungry and thirsty, dry lips cracked and swelled. Sergei, imagining himself at a sumptuous feast, drinking red wine and eating a huge fat goose, fell asleep on dark stones charred by the sun, without even starting a fire. It was morning, and the sun was shining brightly and mercilessly in my eyes. Something was squeezing his chest, preventing him from breathing, and his arms were stiff and unresponsive. Sergei opened his eyes and tried to scream, but nothing worked. There was a gag in his mouth, through which a sound like mooing was coming through. When he lifted his head, he saw a thick rope tightly clutching his hands to his chest. Not far from him Ruslana was squirming and trying to untie or at least loosen the ropes. A good dozen monkey-like trolls swarmed around him, occasionally kicking him and laughing wildly. "You're not that strong." One of them, in tight armor with a gilded helmet, shouted something, kicking everyone who passed him and did not follow his orders. Sergei and Ruslan were loaded onto a wooden wagon and taken in a direction they did not understand. The journey was long, and from time to time the wagon stopped to let the horses rest. Ruslana blamed herself all this time. How could she sleep and not notice how these? And on horseback, they rode up, tied them up and kicked them. They were already being carried over a stone bridge, and a small river was visible below. The thirst that had been hidden by the trolls' blows was immediately aroused. The huge stone walls appeared, and through the wooden gates lined with iron they were proudly brought into the town square. On the square, small troll cubs were running around, as well as old, grey-haired representatives of the elders of the trolls. Suddenly, rotten fruit flew toward Sergei, smearing on his face and turning into a stinking mass. The odor almost made him vomit, but the gag prevented it and the heavy lump went back down. Stopping in the middle of the square, the troll in the golden helmet roared and the prisoners were unloaded onto the stone platform, dropping them unintentionally on the steps. Overcoming the pain, Sergei raised his head, and on the stone tower he saw a troll dressed in colorful robes. The crowd behind the captives knelt and bowed their heads obediently. "So that's what a terrible Varlo you are," Sergei thought to himself. Varlo raised his hairy hand and spoke loudly. "The inhabitants of the glorious city of Kraga, these horrible and ignorant barbarians killed a member of our race, abhorring our laws, people stopped obeying us. They have committed an atrocity for which there is no excuse." The crowd roared, demanding blood, and began to move towards the confused captives. Rows of soldiers closed in, preventing the lynching. Varlo staggered from one foot to the other and descended the steps to the platform where the two prisoners awaited judgment. After assessing the criminals who had dared to kill one of his kin, Varlo bared his fangs. "Before you die, you will see the power and strength of our warriors," turned to the crowd and shouted, "At dawn they will die in the arena." The crowd fell silent for a moment, then burst into joyous shouts, anticipating the spectacle. Several soldiers sprang to the prisoners and dragged them across the courtyard by their feet and threw them into the pit. Ruslana sprawled on the cold floor, and Sergei collapsed with a sob, hitting his head painfully. Ruslana checked the slackened ties and made a few movements with her shoulder to free herself. She took out the gag, took a full chest of air and contentedly began to untie Sergei. When the rope was at his feet, Sergei stood up to his full height, raised his knotty arms and stretched. "Russ, what are we going to do? We have to do something, or we're dead." Ruslana looked up at the thick iron lattice, through which the stars appeared one after another, and said, "We won't get out of here by ourselves. If they haven't killed us now, they'll wait until morning and crucify us at first light, or hang us. What did he say about the arena? Then they'll feed him to hungry lions." "Thank you for calming me down." When Sergei saw the door at the end of the well, he started shouting, "Gads, I'll get out, I'll kill them all." Ruslana thoughtfully sat down in the corner of the pit, looking at Sergei's futile attempts to attract someone's attention, thinking over a plan of escape. But nothing came to mind. Spitting on the floor, she got comfortable and fell asleep with the words "morning, evening is wiser." The first rays of sunshine brought a rumble from somewhere above. The walls of their dungeon shook, small pebbles flying off the edges and falling to the floor with a clatter. Ruslana glanced at Sergei, who was slumped over, bags hanging from his eyes. Apparently he'd been fighting all night, not even time to rest. The ground shook, contented shouts, more like roars, came from somewhere nearby. Suddenly, the door that Sergei had been pounding on all night opened. A dozen well-armed soldiers stood outside, one of them waving to the prisoners. Ruslana was the first to come out. The bright sun was blinding her eyes. Covering her eyes with her hand, she looked around the arena, which looked very much like the arena where gladiators fought in ancient Rome. The huge steps on which the trolls invited to the execution were seated rose to the sky. At the top were huge columns holding the arena vault. On the highest step there was a loggia with 2 gilded thrones. On one of them sat Varlo, devouring a fat boar's thigh, and on the other, apparently, a noble guest. 2 cow horns grew on the guest's head, the tight black armor made the creature even more fearsome, and the red coal eyes penetrated Ruslana's entire being, peering into her very soul. People of Crag, our Almighty Lord, on the occasion of the beginning of the war with these vile people, sent his General of Darkness, Ignat, to demonstrate the power and deadly splendor of the warriors of darkness. By joining them, we will conquer these 2 worlds. After finishing his speech, Varlo sat back on his throne and continued his meal. On the edge of the loggia came out a huge Ignat, drawing his charcoal eyes over the crowd, which immediately quieted down and already in complete silence, loudly said: "Inhabitants of the heroic and invincible Crag! The great and terrible Lord of Darkness Zarfax needs your support in order to conquer both worlds and destroy mankind." Grabbing a stone and demonstratively crushing it with his hand continued, "I present you one of our legions of demon warrior, which as you will see, is not defeatable." Ruslana, listening, didn't notice how the wars surrounding her and Sergei disappeared. Ahead of them the gates swung open, from which came a terrible roar. The trolls sitting in the front rows shrank back in fear and covered their heads with their hands. At the same time, something truly terrifying came slowly through the archway on 4 paws. A horned demon, 1.5 feet tall, was slowly making its way toward where Ruslan and Sergei were standing. Its long front paws were pressed into the ground, compared to its hind paws. Its red eyes glittered and devoured the shaking and stunned humans. Suddenly the creature stopped, standing on the edge of the loggia. Ignat shouted, "Wretched and worthless people, today you will die in honor of our Lord. Therefore, I let you die as warriors, with weapons in your hands." He thrust 2 simple iron swords in their direction. Ruslana raised one of the 2 sharp bogatier swords with a blunt blade, twirled it in her hand, feeling the pleasant heaviness of the metal, proudly raising her head said, "To die, so with music." And at the same moment she rushed at the demon. Following her, not lagging a step behind, with a cry of hurrah ran stumbling Sergei. Ruslana swung her sword and struck the demon with all her anger and hatred, hitting it between the horns. The demon fell back and sat on its hind legs, a small stream of purple blood flowed from the wound. The crowd gasped, apparently worried for the demon's health, which, at the moment, was being tortured with a blunt sword. Sergei, from time to time, trying to bite the monster's torso with his teeth. The demon roared in pain, and swung the back of its clawed paw at Ruslana's body. She flew a dozen meters and collapsed on the Troll King's loggia. The sound of crushed bones cracked behind her, and she stood up on her unsteady legs, wiping the blood from her bloody lips. Ruslana turned back and saw Varlo pressed into the throne, his mouth a thick, dark trickle of blood. Suddenly something heavy came down on her head, and her eyes darkened. Ruslana collapsed to the ground, her dark hair sticking to her face. When she opened her eyes, she struggled to get to her feet. In front of her stood a muscular, 2 heads taller than Ignat, tight muscles braiding his arms, which looked more like logs. His eyes burned with red flames, his powerful beastly teeth showing through his grin. "You, who are you, where did you come from?" Rubbing his fists added, "I will destroy you all." Ignat with a roar made a step towards Ruslana and swung a huge fist, aiming at the head of the devil. Ruslana was not confused, and with a shriek, struck her fist on the general's jaw. There was a crack of breaking bones. Ignat fell on his back. Sitting on his chest, she continued to make numerous monstrous blows to the head. And when Ruslana, leaning on the railings of the loggia, got to her feet, she was exhausted from applying the blows on Ignat's breathless body, which were more like light slapping. Looking at the arena, she smiled through the pain. Sergei, stop mocking the corpse of the animal. Waking up from the animal rage, Sergei stopped. And looking at the bloody sword, which, for some reason, held flat, he kicked the demon's tortured carcass and headed for the exit. Ruslana picked up the red glass ball that had fallen out during the fight at Ignat's feet and followed Sergei, always looking back, expecting an attack. But the trolls stayed where they were. Afraid to even fart, their frightened eyes followed the heroes. At the very gate, the heroes were met on their knees by two lavishly dressed trolls, apparently from the nobility. They handed them silver swords and a leather bag that smelled sweetly of freshly roasted meat and pastry and left. Ruslana glanced back outside the gate, where they were being followed by slaves made up of skinny, troll-tortured men. "Go home," Ruslana shouted, throwing the glass ball she had taken as a trophy from the dead Ignat in their direction. It flew over the heads of the slaves and crashed outside the castle gates. A bright flash blinded his eyes, a wave of hot air knocked him off his feet, a wall of fire rose above the castle, greedily devouring all living things inside. In a moment, the castle was nothing but ruins. "What was that spitting out soot?" said Sergei. "I don't know, but I liked it," Ruslana said with a satisfied grin, rubbing her dusty eyes. Sergei looked at Ruslana, whose face was swollen from numerous bruises, but the smile still remained on her bright scarlet lips. "Where do we go now? It seems that the women got their husbands back. But I don't want to fight demons, it's not our war. I think we should go to that sorcerer in the mountains, and then we'll see." The heroes had been walking in silence for 2 days now, picking their way through the bushes and scratching their bare arms painfully against the hard thorns on the branches. They ate snacks as they walked, taking pieces of meat out of their bags. There was no time for rest, everyone wanted to get home as soon as possible. To collapse on the sofa, hug his wife and do nothing. As they made their way through the already hated bushes, they did not notice how dark it was once again. Ruslana covered her eyes with her hands so that a branch wouldn't accidentally fall into her eyes and waded through the weeds. Her body itched terribly, scratched by thorns, but the will to go home prevailed and she kept walking. Suddenly something collapsed ahead, and she couldn't see anything. She tripped over something baggy and fell to the ground. "Russ, can you get off me?" Sergei grumbled, spreading out on the cold ground. "I think we're out of this weeds." Ruslana got to her feet and looked around. The black forest stretched ahead, the fog enveloping the trunks of mighty trees, covering them with a white blanket. The cold, penetrating breeze left an icy crust on her skin. Suddenly a wolf howl was heard somewhere very near, then another and another. "Gray, we need to get through this forest as quickly as possible, or someone will have a nice dinner." "You know, I was thinking the same thing." "Then catch up." Ruslana pushed Sergei in the side and ran into the fog and disappeared. Sergei didn't want to be someone's dinner, so he rushed after her. Looking around, he noticed huge black shadows that followed them everywhere. "We're being surrounded," Ruslana said as she ran. "I can see it, let's run faster." At that moment Sergei was already running ahead, when suddenly a huge wolf jumped on top of him. Having fallen to the ground, the wolf began to get his toothy mouth to the neck. The mouth stank horribly, drool fell on Sergei's face. He struggled, holding the wolf's ears and not letting the mutant do its dark deed. The cold blade of a sword flashed in the night, the wolf's head remained in Sergei's hands, and the dismembered body collapsed sideways. Ruslana appeared above him out of nowhere, wiping her magnificent sword on the wolf's dead body. "Why are you lying down? You can sleep some more. Come with me." Her voice was tired, but some unknown spark of desire to live still burned in her blue eyes. Sergei stood up. The shadows were still moving, surrounding and cornering their prey. "Run after me, quickly," Ruslana shouted, moving away. Sergei did not object. He ran like a young deer, jumping over small bushes. Suddenly a huge rock appeared in front of him. Finding himself in a dead end, in his head settled panic. From despair Sergei sat on the ground and waited for a terrible death. "Crawl after me, fool!" shouted from somewhere above Ruslana. He now without stopping began to climb the steep wall of the rock. When the fear receded and his heart began to beat less frequently, he looked down. There were dark shadows with huge and terribly scary fangs everywhere. Taking a stone Sergei threw in the direction of the terrible shadows, there was a deafening thud. The wolves, looking at the insolent, roared terribly and apparently began to wait for one of them to fall to the bottom. Sergei looked up where Ruslana was climbing up like a fat-ass spider, gritting her teeth and cursing profanely. "Where are you looking at?" Ruslana shouted, pulling down her short dress. Sergei grinned, because her hemispheres seemed huge compared to the rest of her body. As she climbed higher and higher, Ruslana saw the wide entrance to a dark cave. As she climbed in, she collapsed on the stone floor of the cave, unable to even move her legs, which were still half hanging in the air. Suddenly someone grabbed her leg and pulled her down. Her fingers in the darkness found a ledge and grabbed it and held it with all her remaining strength. Sergei was climbing upwards, grunting and sniffing like a wretch. Having reached the cherished place, he collapsed on the floor of the cave and fell silent. Ruslana's eyes grew dark with the weight, but her fingers could bear the weight of the two men. She crawled away from the edge of the cave and lay down on her back and fell asleep. Ruslana woke up as the bright sunlight stroked her velvety face. She stood up to her full height and looked for Sergei with her eyes. Sergei was sitting on the edge of the cave with his legs hanging down. Holding a fried chicken in his hands, he was gazing into the distance. Turning around with his mouth full, he mumbled, "Oh, you're awake. I did not want to wake you up." On the chicken, holding out a half-chewed carcass, added, "Eat, regain strength." "Thank you. I see you didn't waste time here, you ate almost all of it." Ruslana, having nibbled the remains of the once thick and roasted chicken, followed Sergei, who was moving deeper into the cave. The farther they went, the darker it became. The labyrinth of the cave narrowed and widened. Sometimes they had to climb down. The sharp edges of the walls of the passage scratched their hands, and the cold chilled them to the bone. Ruslana slipped and rolled down the sloping tunnel. Suddenly, the ground went out from under her feet and she plunged with a splash into the icy water of the mountain lake. She swam to the shore, baring her teeth. Behind her back Sergei collapsed into the water with shouts. Huge splashes of icy water splashed Ruslana. A satisfied Sergei giggled as he climbed ashore. "You look more like a kikimora now," he added, "but you don't smell so foul." Ruslana clenched her teeth and examined the stone vaults of the spacious cave. There were 2 cut-out exits, and between them hundreds of old books on shelves. Sergei took out one book at a time, gave a pensive look, put it down, and took the next one. In the middle of the stone room Ruslana noticed a wide stone table. When she came closer, she found an old map unfolded on it. On it, apparently with a pen, the territories of the states were drawn and divided, and also, from the borders led arrows in the direction of a city called Koldam. Suddenly footsteps were heard at one of the cave entrances. Ruslana fumbled for the hilt of her sword, glanced at the dazed, open-mouthed Sergei, who was apparently pretending to be a motionless statue. She tiptoed toward the doorway, trying not to make any noise. An old man emerged from the darkness of the passage, turning the pages of an old book with skinny fingers. He was tall, his chest was as broad as that of a glorious bogatier, and a well-groomed grey beard dangled from his chin. Noticing the guests in his dwelling, he stopped, examined them with a stern look and smiled. "Greetings, heroes, make yourselves at home," he said, inviting them from the table. "I forgot to introduce myself, Merlin." Merlin, the same Merlin who helped Arthur with Camelot in the Middle Ages. Those were glorious times. Sergei came out of his daze and sat down at the table. Ruslana followed suit. The old man carefully rolled up the map, put it on the top shelf of the rack, took out a tablecloth and spread it on the table. "Help yourselves, dear guests," showed his hand on the table, on which already on saucers with golden hems lay roasted bird carcasses, fish with golden crust, fragrant hot bread just taken out of the oven. Sergei didn't hesitate to grab pieces of meat, take a bite and put them back, taking the next piece. Ruslana, looking at him, also began to knead the food, not paying attention to the satisfied and kind eyes of the old man, as if he had not had guests for a long time. Having finished the meal, Sergei wiped his greasy hands on the tablecloth and broke the silence. "Listen, I remember you. You're the old man I saved from the hooligans." "But how? How you got here?" A little thinking and apparently guessing continued. "So it's because of you we're here," already rising menacingly from the table, added, "Bring me home, or you'll regret it." Ruslana stopped eating and with her right hand slowly drew her sword from its sheath. "You will return if you wish. But first I'll tell you something." The old man began to tell about the appearance and formation of the world, more like biblical tales. He smoothly passed on to how angels rebelled against their creator and wished to take power into their own hands, but having lost the battle, God banished them from paradise and condemned them to eternal wandering. Having destroyed the united world into many parts, he departed. The oldest and strongest was imprisoned in hell, inside one of the numerous planets that was formed from a piece of the once mighty world. He put people on the surface of the planet. According to the words of the all-knowing old man, it appeared that people are a vessel in which there is an incredible power, the soul. It held back in imprisonment, embittered for millions of years, the most dangerous and terrible, and once the most intelligent and beautiful angel. His helpers inclined people to various sins and temptations in order to weaken the fetters. But all in vain, and therefore the rulers of darkness decided to destroy humanity, so to speak, to remove the barrier. Why didn't they try before? They did, why wouldn't they? They've tried, subjugated, and destroyed entire nations. And apparently to no avail. Ruslana sat sullenly at the table, glancing occasionally at the men talking. The old man spread his hands. "As you can see, but now one of the dark demons has made an attempt to conquer your familiar world, gathering here a mighty and invincible army." Ruslana pushed into their conversation without warning. "What do you need us for then? Just gather your own army. Smash the hell out of them." The old man grimaced, lowered his eyelids and muttered, "The fairy folk of this world don't care about the fate of mankind, they themselves hate humans for their persecution. Humans destroyed them a long time ago, and so it is quite possible that they will join the army of darkness led by Zarfax. But, not everyone wishes for the death of humanity, and as we have already noticed." Turning his eyes to Sergei, "There are humans in your world too. They are great of once mighty heroes, who didn't want to live in a new world without magic and sorcery. And now they are simple and worthless people who are not interested in anything but the struggle for power. Sergei interrupted the old man and blurted out. Merlin, how did this happen? Well, when you brought us to this wonderful world. I turned out to be an incomprehensible bird, and he turned into a woman. I only moved you. You definitely thought of him when I cast the spell, but why he became a girl, I don't understand. Sergei did not tell Ruslana that he was still thinking of the beautiful maiden at the very moment when the old man had brought him into this world. Ruslana looked at the silent men, glancing at each other incomprehensibly. I still don't understand how I appeared. But not getting an answer, I got up from the table. I walked to the back of the room and said thoughtfully. So, if we return now, then after a while, these things gathered here an army will destroy our world. Yes, said the old man sullenly. Well, then, there is only one way out. What is it? Asked Sergei, coming out of his deep thoughts. We need to kick Zarfax's ass. Sergei looked at Ruslana, who took out a map from the shelf and poked her finger at it. There are hundreds of them, and we're just the two of us. Ruslana wrinkled her mouth and moved her eyebrows down. There's no way, we'll just get to him, and the old man will gather an allied army and smash the traitors to smithereens. The old man looked up, then scratched his silvery beard and said. The plan is simply horrible. But, on the other hand, it's quite unexpected and unpredictable that it might work out. And so it was settled. Merlin left. He still had to rally the allied tribes and peoples, and as it turned out there was very little time. Since dawn, Sergei and Ruslana had been traveling along the path Merlin had indicated towards the city of Koldam. The path through the dense forest was constantly winding like a snake, going to the left, then to the right. It was only towards evening that the nightmarish forest inhabited by wild wolves was behind them. Behind the narrow strip of forest, a huge field of golden wheat suddenly appeared. The sun reflected on each spike, playing and shimmering with golden bunnies. Ruslan and Sergei were walking along a sandy and very narrow path, exhausted from the unbearable heat. Suddenly a crystal lake appeared ahead. The air was filled with freshness and smelled cool. Let's go for a swim, shouted Sergei, taking off his rags, and without waiting for an answer, he rushed into the lake. Ruslana wiped the sweat from her forehead, took off her clothes and carefully hung them on the nearest bush. Smoothly descended into the lake. The water was excellent, warm as steamy milk, but at the same time refreshing. Ruslana came out of the water and lay down in the shade of a mighty oak tree. Her eyelids began to close by themselves and she fell asleep without noticing that she had fallen asleep. Enough sleep, we have a hell of a long way to go, came Sergei's disgruntled voice. I'm not sleeping, I'm sunbathing, Ruslana muttered, and turned her back defiantly. Well, 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 you sunbathe well in the moonlight, don't burn yourself, Sergei said with a light sneer. Ruslana opened her eyes and looked around, not believing her eyes. There was darkness all around, the moon illuminated the fields with a cold and dead light. Ruslana stood up and shook off the dust. It's time to go, so no one will notice us. Well, it's time, so it's time. And having already found a path in the darkness, they followed it towards the blazing lights ahead. As they got closer, they could see the horror of the village. The wooden houses were burning with bright red flames, the tortured corpses of people lay on the roadside, as if they had tried to escape, but something very terrible had caught up with them and killed them. What happened here? Sergei shouted in horror, examining each corpse, trying to find a single survivor. Ruslana walked silently toward the center of the village, sword gripped tightly in her hand, expecting an attack at every second. After looking through all the back alleys and holes, Sergei did not find a living soul. The village was already far behind them, burned down by whom and for what reason, and the two wanderers were mournfully walking forward. Ruslana was the first one who couldn't stand it. "I don't understand, why burn the village, kill the civilians? What did they do wrong? Definitely some undead did it. I'd like to catch them and put them on the pyre, so that they'd burn to ashes." Ruslana looked at Sergei, who by the looks of it was already imagining himself as an inquisitor and dealing with the undead. "When we find the undead, I'll give you the opportunity to perform the execution," Ruslana muttered. Sergei walked forward without noticing her words and only occasionally uttered swear words about all the undead that do not give life to people. Ruslana looked around and stopped at a rest stop and opened her bag. "Sergei, don't you think we should have found a better place to rest? We are on this field, as in the palm of our hands. If any jerk on the head will knock and it's gone." Sergei looked around bewildered, calmly and leisurely said, come on, eat up. As if you don't get creepy at the thought that all the responsibility lies with us. And if we can defeat these things, the world will remain the same, and if not, maybe you're right, and maybe we're the only ones who can stop the undead." Ruslana shrugged her shoulders and took a good piece of meat and began to eat it, looking around from time to time. After finishing her meal and wiping her hands on the cloak of Sergei, who had turned away, she lay on her back and looked at the white and fluffy clouds slowly floating across the sky. "Well, we must go. Let's go, what can we do? I didn't think that the poor old lady will not let you sleep." Sergei smiled and said, "What an old lady! I don't see where your keek has gone. Do all old ladies walk with cues?" "Well, of course they do, and it hurts to hit with them." "Yes. You must have tried the cue on your body." Yet, Sergei said thoughtfully. All going deep into the fields for talking heroes and did not notice as a dark blanket on them descended night. The ground warmed by the sun was still warm, but the air was getting colder. It was not difficult for Sergei to make a fire. He sat down, closer to the warmth, and waited for Ruslana to return from the hunt. Suddenly the tall grass rustled and Ruslana jumped out of it on all fours, panting with frantic eyes. "Take out the fire, run!" "What happened? The boars have organized a hunt for you." "Trampling into the ground the charcoal burns," sneered Sergei. Ruslana hissed, pressing her index finger to her lips. In the next instant she crawled into the thick grass and disappeared there. Sergei followed her example and crawled forward, lurching from side to side. At that moment they heard heavy footsteps approaching them. Sergei stopped, hushed, and began to listen carefully in the darkness. "Are you sure that this elf ran this way?" "Definitely. I'll scour the area and kill the spy," said someone's rough grunting voice. When the footsteps began to move away, Sergei squatted down, stretched his neck and stared into the terrifying darkness. Ruslana's quiet voice sounded nearby. "What an idiot!" Sergei turned his head in the direction where Ruslana should have been, as suddenly a monstrous figure in knight's armor and with a pig's snout instead of a face grew in front of him. The monster examined Sergei and shrieked with a piercing shriek. "Here, I've found the infiltrator!" At the same moment, the rapidly approaching footsteps of several creatures were heard. Sergei was confused from surprise and did not know what to do. There was a thud, the monster shrieked and, sticking out its tongue, fell to the ground, and a familiar female figure took its place. "Why are you still sitting there? Let's run faster," Ruslana shouted in a commanding voice. Sergei woke up, jumped to his feet, and ran after Ruslana. Behind him he heard cursing and shouting, apparently the pursuers were not lagging behind. But after half an hour the voices began to drift away, and without noticing anything under his feet he ran headlong into the huge pond that blocked his way. Following him into the pond ran Ruslana, and lurking in the water quietly said, "What a run you're on, I almost caught up with you. I thought you were way ahead of me. You almost overtook me at the very beginning," she added, looking around. "At least you didn't lead me into the swamp, Hero Susanan." At the same moment Ruslana stopped talking and slowly sank into the water. Sergei followed her example and began to listen in the darkness. "Well, where to look for them now? I won't go into that pond and I won't send warriors there. If they've fallen into Hydra's clutches, they're welcome to it. If they've fallen into Hydra's clutches." Everyone returned to the fortress. The troops began to move away, leaving only columns of dust behind them, and in a moment there was no one on the shore. After waiting for a while, Ruslana slowly made her way to the shore. Her body was shivering in the cold water, and her legs were shaking. She threw off the marsh mud and sat down on the shore, hugging her knees with her hands to warm up a little. "Come on, they're gone," Ruslana said through gritted teeth. Sergei looked around and slowly, almost crawled out of the water. Sitting down next to Ruslana, he picked his nose and ears, freeing them from the mud, and said, "If I'm not mistaken, these pig snouts are called orcs." "It doesn't make me feel any better that they're orcs," Ruslana said. "I don't know what kind of creatures you can't meet here, at least once I've met some good ones to give them a drink and put them to bed." "Yeah, you wish. Listen, stop throwing stones into the pond." At the same moment a huge monster with 6 gigantic heads on long and thick snake necks came out of the pond with a splash. The monster resembled more like the Gorainik serpent from children's fairy tales, but much scarier. Opening his mouth and frozen in place, Sergei stopped even breathing from the overwhelming fear. One head of the monster hovered over the frightened people and showing huge yellow teeth issued a piercing roar. Ruslana was splattered with saliva from head to toe. Ruslana woke up from the pungent odor of the monster's salivary secretions and sliding on the ground tried to strike the monster's neck with her sword. But the sword blade bounced off the neck of the snakehead with a ringing sound, only making the monster angry. "What is this stuff? How to kill this thing?" Ruslana shouted with tears in her eyes from her helplessness. "It's Hydra, throwing stones at the monster's head," wailed Sergei. One of the snake heads of the monster grabbed Ruslana's leg with its powerful jaws, lifted her above the water and wrapped its muscular neck like a snake began to strangle the human body. Grasping with her hands as hard as she could, Ruslana made her last attempts to free herself. But her strength quickly left her, her chest was so tight that it was impossible to breathe. Seeing the signs of life leave Ruslana, Sergei, mad with anger, threw his fists at Hydra, but she did not let him close, and once again he fell to the ground beaten. Raising his head, he noticed how several dozen arrows flying with a whistle from the dark forest hit the body of Hydra, and at the place of collision with the stone scales flames appeared. With a loud and shrill hiss, the monster let go of Ruslana's breathless body. At the same instant, Sergei rushed into the water. Grabbing the thin maiden's neck, he began to pull her to dry land. Having got out of the unfortunate lake, Sergei lowered Ruslana's body to the ground. Bowing his head, he listened to her heartbeat. Hearing a quiet, slow pounding in the girl's chest, he calmed down. "At least she's alive, and that's good," he said, wiping the clinging mud off her forehead. In an instant, about 10 absolutely identical archers appeared in front of Sergei. They looked truly miraculous in their steel, tight armor. Also among them was a beautiful black-haired girl, in a long blue dress, like the sky, slightly covering a lovely figure. She resembled Ruslana in the structure of her ears, but at the same time she was different and beguiling in the mere sight of her. Slowly passing Sergei, the girl bent over Ruslana and said, "Bring her to the camp, and be quick about it, the poison has already begun to take effect." At the same instant a shiver ran through Sergei's body. "Like poison, we need to call an ambulance." The girl turned to him incomprehensibly. "What ambulance?" "Well, someone else," recovered Sergei. Soldiers on a homemade wooden stretcher began to carry Ruslana into the forest. Sergei hurried after them, checking Ruslana's well-being from time to time. "We'll fight you again," he said to himself. In about half an hour they came to a huge green meadow, in the middle of which stood a magnificent crystal castle. The top of the castle stood in the sky, dividing the slowly floating clouds in two. At the very gates of the castle they were met by two riders who also looked very much like his companions. "Aniel, we've been expecting you." One of the riders looked at the woman on the stretcher and added, "It looks like you've been ambushed." "No, I met this elf at the Lake of Stone Hydra." "Then where is this man from?" the rider said menacingly. "Apparently he was with her." "It can't be, we've been feuding with humans for a long time." In the elven conversation without permission Sergei intervened. "This is my friend, and in general can we save her life or decide with whom to feud and with whom to ally?" The rider furrowed his brow and gestured toward the castle. At the same moment, the silver gate flaps parted in different directions, giving free passage to the travelers. The rider turned to the confused Sergei and said in a calm voice, "Welcome, man, to the elven capital. My name is Arian, be my guest, please." Arian turned his horse and galloped to the castle. Aniel's riflemen followed the rider as if by order, lifting the stretcher on their shoulders. Sergei, trying not to lose sight of his wounded friend, hurried after them and had time to look at the local sights. Climbing the high stairs they got into a huge hall, the walls of which were painted with gilded inscriptions and intricate patterns. Turning down the hall, right in front of Sergei's nose, two guards closed the tall doors. "Don't worry, she's safe now," Aniel said quietly as a spring brook. Sergei did not cross this beautiful and gentle girl and humbly followed her. Once in the throne room, he stopped near the entrance. Surprisingly there were about 100 elves, a dozen centaurs, the same number of dwarves, fairies with human height were flying near the dome, women and men were arguing about something, and at the sight of Aniel they instantly became silent. She slowly walked along the soft carpeted path to the throne and facing the hall she said in a ringing voice, "Glorious people of the Elven Alliance, we have endured much and always remained in the shadows. But our time has come to draw our sword and fight the forces of evil. Some of our lands have already been taken by the servants of the bloodthirsty Zarfax." The crowd began to whisper and Aniel's further words could not be heard. From the crowd came the voice of a bearded dwarf. "Why are we going to fight, that we have nothing else to do?" The rest of the dwarves supported their leader, they were later joined by fairies alienated by earthly cares. The old centaur shouted loudly and condemningly. The dwarf raised his axe and shouted, "And you, what? And you can serve everyone like that?" The dwarves waved their axes in front of the centaurs, demonstrating what would happen to them if they were attacked. And the centaurs were gesticulating vigorously, calling the dwarves to themselves. "Enough is enough," Arian's voice boomed through the hall, "I won't let you make a mess in my castle. And what will a man think of us?" A wave of words rolled through the hall and the crowd began to look around and noticed the stranger began to glare at him. Sergei stood at a loss and did not know what to do, either to run away or to say something inarticulate. Without choosing anything he went to the place where Aniel was standing. Standing at her right hand, he said, "Hello." Aniel, realizing that Sergei has no experience with the people, began to speak on his behalf. "This man made a peace agreement with the elf, which proves that people can also join our alliance to get rid of evil." The bearded dwarf interrupted. "Humans, that's what evil is. They are greedy." "Who would say?" interrupted the old centaur. The dwarf, ostentatiously showing his axe, continued. "Say, man, how many warriors are in your castle?" Sergei bowed his head and answered. "Well, whoa, there are 2 of us. Me and the elf, Ruslana." "That's an alliance," began to mock him dwarf. Sergei, notwithstanding the ridicule from this stunted little man, gave out. "So, what if there are 2 of us? We beat the demon, crushed Varlo, killed the General of Darkness Ignat, and nothing intact. Merlin himself told us that you will help us to capture the demonic city of Koldam." As he rose from his throne, Arion approached Sergei. "It's been a long time since I've heard that name. Tell me more about how you got to him." Sergei, without stopping, almost in one breath, began to tell their story of getting to this world and what would happen to all creatures if the forces of evil triumph. This time no one interrupted him, and he, having calmed down, finished his story. Apparently, the elves did not know the details and listened attentively to the story the man was telling. "Maybe he's lying and was sent here as a spy," came from the crowd. Aniel looked Sergei in the eye and said, "I trust this man, and what he has just told me is the truth, and to confirm his words I will go with these heroes to Koldam." Arion put his hand on Aniel's shoulder, stopping her, and said, "Wait, where are you going? You don't even know these barbarians. I understand their suffering. And for the dream of a prosperous world, I agree to sacrifice myself. Therefore, I cannot give you orders. Therefore, I cannot command you. And so I give you my 12 soldiers to help you on this final quest. And may there be peace on earth." Arion did not interfere and did not stop Aniel, because after thinking about it, he decided that if these fools had traveled halfway across the world and had not perished, then the gods were on their side and would not let them die. It was morning, and the dew lay in diamond drops on the green grass. The sun slowly and tenderly warmed the earth, as if it cared for and cherished every blade of grass. A sweet and gentle breeze was blowing, forcing the mighty giant trees to wake up. Ruslana was awake at this time. Thoughts of the future of the world were in her head. She remembered her hometown, the river dividing it into 2 halves. The bridge, which had been repaired for years, but they still couldn't do it. But the worst thing is that everything will change and it's impossible to return the old, what she loved.